Okay, so you've been talking about the relationship between the waking up traditions and the growing up traditions. I want to talk about another interesting and maybe even trickier dual relationship, which is the subject object relationship. So
Yep.
specifically here, mind brain.
Yep.
So you mentioned psychedelics, and that takes us right there. So we can induce brain states chemically or with transcranial magnetic stimulation or whatever,
Right.
and produce subjective changes pretty reliably. We can also do things phenomenologically with our consciousness that change what we see showing up on a QEEG.
Yeah.
So it's, of course, it's not surprising that since the ontologic categories of subjectivity and objectivity are so different and they're clearly related somehow, that when we have an epistemology, we have a method of studying the objective and we see that they're correlated, we end up collapsing the subjective to being an emergent property of the objective. Mind emerges from neural networks. And from neural networks, right?
Yes and no.
I'm saying it's pretty easy for, if I have a scientific method that can study the objective, to say if there's something other than objective that correlates with objective, it's an emergent property of.
Yes. Yeah. And
just to complete this so that you can speak to the whole thing, it's also somewhat easy if you have a method that studies the subjective to say all of objectivity is either Maya or is arising as a structure of consciousness. So either side can kind of collapse the right-hand quadrants to an emergent phenomena of the left or vice versa.
Yep.
So getting into why tetra arising,
right,
deeply fundamental co-arising is an important thing.
Right.
What the basis for that is,
right,
and specifically the mind-brain interface of where we can address the psychopharmacology of brains and bodies and affect consciousness, and the consciousness that can then affect both consciousness and health.
Right.
Speak to that for us, please.
Right. Well, one of the things that we do with integral meta theory, and the way that we look at the quadrants anyway, is essentially to say that these four quadrants are four different dimensions of a single happenstance, a single occurrence. And if we just look at the upper left and upper right, although there's, depending on how you define a consciousness, there's subject and object in both of those. But most commonly, subjective domain is taken to be the interior of the individual, the upper left, and objective is taken to be the exterior, the upper right. If you go all the way back to a billion or 2 years after the Big Bang, and then you work with something like Alfred Whitehead's philosophical description of moment-to-moment existence and what's happening. I like Whitehead because he doesn't attempt to derive subject from object or object from subject, but tends to see them arising, co-arising, although they interact in very influential ways. But a moment comes to be as a subject of experience, and so it's got a little bit of proto-feeling or proto-awareness or proto-consciousness, whatever that interior, Whitehead called it prehension, or whatever that prehension is. And while that's arising, then that subject will prehend the previous subject, making it object, and then it will add its own degree of novelty. So what we're really getting is each moment both transcends, because it adds a degree of novelty, and it includes, because it prehends the previous moment. So subject and object are interwoven in this moment-to-moment, transcend and include fashion. And if you track those, if you go ahead and track the interior of that atom and the exterior of that atom, then what you see throughout the ages is you come upon life forms, and then, the first life form, we have atoms coming together as molecules, and molecules coming together as the first cells. So if we stop at cells, there's still cellular now prehension, and that's the interior proto-feeling, proto-subjective aspect of that moment. And then the object is anything you can see about a cell by looking at a microscope, for example. So that's the matter energy component of it. And as those are going to just continue evolving, then we're going to arrive where we have a human body with a triune brain, and those are all exteriors. And on the interior, we have the whole prehensive unifications at every major evolutionary stage of development. And that includes going all the way back to there are atoms, and then there's an atomic prehension, and those are in molecules with a molecular prehension. Those are in cells with a cellular prehension, and then those are in multicellular organisms, and those go through fish into reptiles into mammals, and then we have a human body. And that human body has holons going all the way back to Big Bang. It has quarks, it has atoms, it has molecules, it has cells up to tree of life. And then when you get to the first human beings themselves, 50,000 years ago, they start out using Gebser's stages. Again, they start out at an archaic stage. Then about 50,000 years ago, the magic stage emerged. And then around 5,000 years or so ago, the mythic stage emerged, and then the rational stage. So we get up to rational stage here on the upper left, on the interior subjective consciousness component. And then corresponding with that in the upper right is a triune brain with all the exterior matter, energy, physiological complexity, and so on that has. And these have co-arisen together all the way back to the Big Bang. And
if you don't mind, I just want to interject one thing so the listeners follow it who are new to your work. I want everyone to get that the idea of something like a panpsychism, that there is consciousness or something like consciousness, protoqualia at various levels. You notice that all of the levels that Ken described, and he said, hold on, are self-organizing systems in universe. So he didn't say there's something that it's like to be your car or a salt shaker, right, which is a complicated, non-self-organizing system. When you look at the self-organization of atoms or molecules or cells, the idea that there is a self other than self distinction from a self-organizing boundary that occurs with the internal and external forces that make that boundary is a radically clearer way of thinking of panpsychism than anything that you can identify at all, even if non-self-organizing has a protoqualia. So it's just an important thing to make sure you get. So,
and I mean, I'm not. I've never even been comfortable, let's say, with Whitehead's presentation of prehension, because it seems like he's putting just a little bit too complex subjective realities into an extremely simplified form, and so it's not quite enough. So I've always thought, particularly at the lower stages of overall development, starting with quarks or even strings, quarks, atoms, molecules, is that they certainly have an exterior. I mean, that's every scientist in the world would maintain that they've got some sort of exterior, and I simply maintain, well, yeah, exteriors don't make any sense without interiors. I mean, they have to go together. So whatever the exterior is, it's got an interior. And I'm not a panpsychic, I'm a pan-interiorist. Anything that's got an outside, it's got an inside, or it just doesn't make sense. It just has no sense at all. And then you can put anything you want to in it. And for some people, they just not going to believe atoms have any sort of prehension at all. And so in those sort of worst cases, I'll say, fine. You can see the evolutionary sequences in all the quadrants. So wherever you're comfortable putting consciousness in, do it. Presumably by shrimp or deer or apes. Some point it pops in there. And the only important thing is don't collapse the quadrants. That's the disaster of trying to to reduce mind to brain or brain to mind. That doesn't work. And that's the whole point about the 4 quadrants, is that they are irreducible. And that's just a very simple but extremely important rule of thumb that stops an enormous number of absolutely catastrophic confusions. So
at some point in a different podcast, for those who are interested, a very deep dive into prehension at the early levels, the hard problem and foundational ontology would be fun.
Sure.
But as we continue, and what's going to be interesting and useful for most people, so there is a co-evolution of subject and object of upper left and upper right quadrants.
Yeah.
Now the question is, they both seem to be co-influencing. I don't want to say bidirectional causation, because even causation is a particular type of influence.
Right. Yep.
And so, if someone watched your video where you're doing some meditative thing and the neural correlates on the EEG are changing,
right,
or someone has taken psychedelics and they're like, it seems like consciousness is just a result of what I do to brain chemistry.
right.
How do we understand those things together?
This tends to be something that I have run into a lot over the years. And it has to do not only with those quadrants, but with literally all of those dimensions that I was mentioning are areas that I have eventually found to be important and to be real and to have plenty of evidence for. And this includes quadrants and levels of development, lines of development, states of consciousness, various types, and so on. And it's very, very rare that a person will be persuaded by any type of facts or logic or argument to accept the reality of these dimensions. It's almost like they're native. I don't believe that. But people tend to be open to these things, or you just can't really seem to get them to come along. And people tend to have very, very strong feelings about mind and brain. And there's still, you look at Journal of Consciousness Studies, and it's almost about half and half. All of consciousness is nothing but brain physiology. And others are, no, wait, you only know physiology through experience. Experience is primary, upper left is real. And I just throw my hands up. If any one of these arguments is really compelling, it would have won the day by now. No side of this argument has ever won. And that's why the hard problem is still the hard problem, except for integral meta theory. Now, we haven't solved it, but it's not a problem for us because we simply take these to be co-arising, tetra-arising, correlative realities. And at the very least, both of them are equally real. Now, we can always find little ways that there are certain kinds of bidirectional causality occurring. There's also tetracausality occurring. There's all sorts of things going on. But what doesn't work is to reduce one to the other without remainder. It's never worked. It never will.
One of my favorite examples of just what you're mentioning right now is it really is kind of like the symbol grounding problem in AI. If the symbol doesn't have a multi-dimensional intersecting sensory experience and it just doesn't ground, you'd know the chemistry of the strawberry, but not what it tastes like, and it's still not grounding. So you watch, when obviously people like Sam Harris and Dan Dennett are on the same side of consciousness or subjectivity emerging from brain, and yet Sam writes the book on free will, Dan writes the critique, they go back and forth, and Sam thinks consciousness is real, but free will isn't. Dan thinks free will is real, but consciousness isn't. And they're both coming from a post-Popper philosophy of science that has the same epistemology and the same rules of critical thinking, and they're looking for the same logical fallacies. And at the very end of the argument, Sam says the smartest thing that he says in the whole time, which is, apparently we just have different intuitions on this.
That's about it.
And that is actually a really insightful thing to say, is that the idea that this is a pure axiom, data, logical conclusion process isn't actually true, because the argument either lands as true or not based on its correlation with experience.
And what's not completely clear is presumably there's some type of experienced evidence that a person could have that would change their mind. And people do change their minds, and presumably it's for reasons. I bring this up because it reminds me of another place that I see this all the time. Namely, people having beliefs that can't be altered by evidence or facts or argument. And that's with the beliefs that are generated by the stages of growing up development themselves. So if you have somebody at magic or at mythic or at rational or pluralistic, you take somebody at a mythic literal fundamentalist stage of development. They are convinced the Bible is literally true. It's the word of God. And you can say, well, how about things like the fossil record? And they'll go, oh, right, the fossil record. The Lord created that on the fifth day. And you go, no, you don't understand. Let me try it again. But it's not going to happen. And no amount of evidence, no amount of fact, no amount of argument, because the interpretive grid through which they are seeing everything won't allow it to arise. And that it just reminds me when I see these kinds of arguments about the reality of the entire data domain. It could be just an honest intellectual mistake. It's a conclusion they make and they're just not quite thinking well. Or it could be there's some sort of experiential occasion that's going to give them the type of data that will have them change their minds. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I keep hoping that we can find something like that.
Let's not try and actually properly address the whole ontology of the mind-brain interface here, but let's address the part that everyone experiences as real, which is if I've got someone who has some chronic physical pain or anxiety or depression or addiction, there are psychotherapeutic processes that actually help. There are physiotherapeutic processes that help. And they don't help the same for everyone. So one of the things we talk about at Neurohacker is, did someone's anxiety happen right after a black mold exposure? I'm probably not going to CBT it away. If I've got excitotoxicity from certain mycotoxins, did it happen after a head injury? Did it happen after an acute PTSD-like trauma? Had they always had it because of early childhood attachment dynamics? And anyone's anxiety might be multifactorial result of lots of those things, some of which are largely psychological, and even within that domain of different types, some physiological with different types. So as we start to think about what is a system of human flourishing, and of course, if their environment still has mold, that's a lower quadrant phenomena. Or if they're around people that are lying to them all the time and they can feel it, so they're anxious as fuck because they don't know what's true, it's a lower quadrant phenomena. So if someone comes and tells me they've got an anxiety disorder, I have to do an all quadrant assessment to even have a sense of where I'm going to start my processes. And that would be true for me with pretty much anything. If they say they have depression, I'm not going straight to they need to know their supreme self or straight to you have head trauma. I don't know.